And Louis got rubbed out of the list of England's monarchs because his acclamation was, with hindsight, withdrawn. That was because the barons had not expected Louis to appoint his friends from France and Flanders as his chief councillors. They'd expected to be given much more control over what went on, and then they thought, there's a better option. John had a 9-year-old son, Henry. Of course, no child had ever been king, but there's a first time for everything, and if the king was a child and one of the barons was regent, then the barons really would be running things. Of course, Louis controlled London, but the child was at Corfe Castle, and they could at least get him to the nearest abbey, Gloucester, to crown him. Of course, they didn't have the crown, but they could use his mother's gold neckband. Actually, they didn't have an archbishop available to do the coronation. Never mind, the Bishop of Winchester was available and had the keys to the treasury. It wasn't a well-attended ceremony. Not even all of John's executors could get there, but it would have to do. Naturally, little Henry III was not actually exercising the powers of king. That was the job of a baron, the regent. The chap that got the job was a 70-year-old Earl of Pembroke, William Marshal, a safe pair of hands if ever there was one, Old Faithful. Marshal had long ago been a bold young knight in the days of Henry I, the child's grandfather. He'd worked his way up the greasy pole of advancement by the simple, if very unusual, principle of loyalty to his lord and total trustworthiness. Everyone trusted him, and now the barons expected him to get rid of Louis and rule on behalf of little Henry. And Louis was roundly defeated. In the end, he agreed to go back to France and agree he'd never been King of England at all. And all the barons and bishops who'd acclaimed him as king agreed that they'd never done anything of the sort. Everyone became patriotic. For the first time since the Norman conquest, the French were being described as foreigners, looting the English. The barons all spoke French, and they had nothing in common with the villeins on their lands, but they were beginning to feel English. And William Marshal reissued Magna Carta and said that all the old laws and rights of England were exactly what Henry III wanted to uphold. William Marshal died, the grand old hero of England, in 1219, and Henry was given a proper coronation at Westminster the following year. As Henry grew up, the barons and bishops had no intention of letting him get away from them. He learned to do as he was told, and that pretty much defined him as a king. What the barons and the bishops hadn't thought about was that one day he would be listening not to them, but to his wife. Perhaps one of them should have married him. Instead, in 1236, he married Eleanor, a younger daughter of the Count of Provence. He was 29, she was about 19, and she wrapped him round her finger. She arrived with her uncle, who immediately started running the king's life and carted huge amounts of treasure off to his homeland. Then she got another uncle installed as Archbishop of Canterbury. Her physician became the Bishop of Durham, and large sums of money supposedly going to her mother were actually funding the wars of her brother-in-law, the Duke of Anjou. She was inevitably, staggeringly unpopular. And however little money the king had, he always seemed able to support her relatives abroad, paying for their courts and their armies. In 1263, the population of London rose in rebellion. Their targets were Flemish bankers, Jewish financiers, and Queen Eleanor. She was in the Tower of London, London's royal palace, and got away from the Watergate to slip down the Thames to Windsor. As her boat approached London Bridge, she was pelted with missiles by a crowd shouting, "Drown the witch!" She managed to get back to the safety of the tower. The kingdom had become ungovernable, at least by this king and queen. This was not the same country it had been in 1066. Towns had grown, trade had grown, London had grown. With the barons losing influence and Londoners angry, the crown itself was in danger. England was on the edge of revolution. Enter the revolutionary, a Frenchman on the make, the charming, clever younger son of a powerful and ruthless Norman lord, a chancer with style, Simon de Montfort. France was now ruled by King Louis's widow on behalf of their young son. She was a shrewd woman who decided that young Simon was dangerous stuff and forced him to escape abroad. He'd come to England in 1231, when he was about 23, intending to recover land his family had lost years ago. And he was really good at it. He became the best of friends with the impressionable Henry in no time, and Henry's sister fell for him. In 1238 they were married, and he was given back those lost family lands. He was Earl of Leicester. The English were suspicious of foreigners, so Simon completely converted into an Englishman. In 1239, Henry and Eleanor had a son. Simon sponsored the baptism. They chose the name Edward, after the great Anglo-Saxon king Edward the Confessor. This French royal family had adopted English patriotism. But as the political crisis deepened, Simon became increasingly committed to the total reform of government. Eventually, the crisis became a full-blooded civil war, and by the time the war ended in 1264, Henry and his son Edward were Simon's prisoners, and he took over the country. Simon now set about inventing an entirely new form of government, one which was based on the deeply rooted English principle of consent. In 1265, he summoned a meeting of the country, a parliament, at Westminster, to endorse his government. He summoned not only barons and bishops, but also 2 knights from each shire, and, most extraordinary, representatives from all the boroughs, the towns.
He said he was acting in the king's name, but the king didn't have much to do with what was going on. In fact, Simon had established what we might see as a modern state. There was a written constitution, a symbolic king, a powerful leading minister, and there was a parliament with representatives of the church, the countryside, represented by great landowners and gentry, and of towns. We might see it like that. They didn't. To most people at the time, this was clearly the tyranny of Simon de Montfort.
By now, Prince Edward was a grown man, 25 years old, and it was his job to overthrow this tyranny and restore the crown. First, of course, he had to escape imprisonment at Hereford Castle. The prince was allowed to exercise his horse on the common, so he wore out his guards' horses, racing with them, and then jumped onto a fresh horse that had been brought for the purpose and disappeared into the distance. What followed is known as the Battle of Evesham, at the end of which Simon de Montfort was chopped up into pieces. Henry was back on his throne, but it was Edward who was now running the country. This tall, muscular warrior, he was called Longshanks, had the military skill to crush the remaining rebels and the good sense not to punish them afterwards. He understood how to make peace and accepted the proposition that the king must respect legal limits on his power and consult with the nation. He also habitually spoke English, the first royal to do so since 1066. Parliament made him the steward of England. De Montfort's revolution had left its mark. The old king died in 1272, having reigned for 56 years.